Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I am joined by Mark Minkjan. Mark describes himself as an urban and architectural geographer. He is the editor-in-chief of Failed Architecture and produces the Failed Architecture podcast. Failed Architecture is this really great online publication that seeks to reconnect architecture to the real world and exploring the meaning of architecture in contemporary society. It's a site that I discovered a few years ago and have just been a really big fan of, and I think they've produced some really great essays and podcasts about architecture and design discourse in kind of today's world. In this conversation, Mark and I talk about how he got interested in architecture and writing and the goals for Failed Architecture and how he thinks of Failed Architecture's kind of editorial point of view. We also talk about the state of architecture and design discourse. We talk about independent publishing and the role of the critic. It covers all sorts of scratching the surface topics and is a really interesting one, I think, that you'll really enjoy. If you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or just $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that I think of as the director's commentary track for the podcast. Each month I share additional content, episode previews, and short little essays related to the themes of the podcast. These memberships really help with the ongoing production of the podcast. I just really appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoy this fascinating conversation with Mark Minkjan. On your bio on the Failed Architecture website, your title or your bio lists you as an urban and architectural geographer. And I've never heard that term before, and I kind of want to start with that. What is an urban and architectural geographer? What does that mean?
Oh yeah. I made up the architectural geographer part.
Okay.
An urban geographer is I studied urban geography here in Amsterdam at the university. That's basically what other universities would call human geography or urban studies. So it's human geography with like a focus on cities. That's actually the kind of geographical approach that I try to bring to architecture. So I think it's about putting things into looking at them in the context of space and time. Mm-hmm. So putting things into perspective, basically, and that's I think that's what I like or try to do with architecture.
You said you studied urban geography is what it was called?
Yeah.
And so why did you do that? What was your interest at the time, or what does someone who studies urban geography usually kind of go on to do after studying that?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, let's see. Those are a few questions. I think before that I studied economics.
Oh, okay.
Which was a very useful move for finding out that was really what I did not want to do.
Yeah.
And then I met some people who were, I tried out some sociology, anthropology, and then I met some people who were more into who were studying geography, and that sounded really appealing, so I also made that move. What was your second question about that? Again?
I mean, like, what somebody who studies that, what kind of jobs are there, or what? Even someone like yourself who kind of just kind of saw it, and you're like, yeah, this looks like something I could do. What was your kind of thinking of like, oh, this is the life I would have with this, or were you even thinking about?
Yeah. No, I had no idea. Also, and when I explained it to my parents, when I told them what I was going to do, this was also one of their first questions, of course.
Yeah.
And I couldn't really tell them. I just knew that this sounded really fascinating. This is something that I really want to do. But I also myself, I didn't really know where it would lead me. And I think my father also said, "Oh, that's the dumbest thing that you can do."
Yeah, I
And
love that.
no, I wasn't really sure myself either. But I guess many people who do study it end up in either in research, in academic careers, working for municipalities, governments, or consultancy organizations, planning, things like that. Yeah.
And so where did architecture kind of come into that? Was that something that was happening in that program? Was that something that you were kind of always interested in? How did those things start to come together for you?
Mm-hmm. Um, I think um, I think architecture. I don't remember like exactly when, but at some point I figured that architecture is actually very useful to make these geographical. I don't know, to this way of looking at the world more concrete. Because even though it is, geography, it is about place, it is about space, about regions, about cities. Still, they're often about pretty abstract, let's say, developments or phenomena like social inequality or economic development. And at some point, I think I noticed that architecture is a very useful medium to talk about these things. So you can use architecture to talk about these issues or these types of research and make them also more appealing, maybe, or
Right.
or yeah. I mean, things. I mean, we live in a visual culture, so things need some sort of a illustration, I think, to reach people. So that's where architecture is useful for.
It's interesting to me that it sounds like architecture was almost secondary to your interest, that you were interested in these kind of human phenomena, these larger questions, and architecture was a way to make it concrete, to make it real, as opposed to being interested in buildings and then moving out to look at kind of humans and interaction. It was almost the inverse, where it was like idea first, then architecture, right? You know what does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you're right. I mean, it's not like I wasn't interested in buildings before, but I didn't know anything about architecture. Which is also, I think, maybe we can talk about that later, but which is, I think, a problem of the architectural discourse, so to say, that it feels very exclusive. Like, you're not allowed to talk about this because you're not an architectural theorist or an architectural historian.
Yeah.
But yeah, my development as an architecture writer started later. So I don't know if that's retroactively, but no, I think I call myself like an amateur architectural historian also. So, reading up on a lot of things in the past, I don't know, 8-9 years. So no, you're right. That it was a secondary thing, but and interestingly enough, like now, I am also a little bit like part of the architectural discourse,
right?
So it feels strange. It's a strange position or place to be in.
I mean, so just to follow this thread a little bit, or to kind of follow your kind of trajectory into architecture, and speaking about you kind of now being a part of the discourse in a way, can you talk a little bit about how that happened? Or so you kind of you're in this program, you realize architecture is this way to kind of look at these issues. How did you find yourself? I mean, I don't even know if you would call yourself a quote unquote architecture writer, but how did you find yourself as someone who is writing about architecture for a lot of these kind of big architecture publications.
Yeah, I think it just happened along the way. Well, failed architecture has been has had a big role in that, and has been a big platform. But even before that, I started a personal blog. I think it was also around 2010, and it was called City Breaths. So it's completely unpronounceable, at least for me, a name. So yeah, I just started writing about urban developments, but also about architecture, just to like train myself and to get familiar with the vocabulary, with writing in English, it was also a way for me to keep track of what was going on. So it was also a bit of a personal archive.
Yeah.
And then shortly after I started that, actually, we here in Amsterdam, we started Failed Architecture. Me together with, or actually I only joined in a little bit later, but it's and that really, of course, I mean, the name already like directs everything to architecture. I had to start writing about architecture, of course.
Okay, so I didn't realize that Failed Architecture was so early in your writing career. For some reason, I was under the impression that you were kind of writing for a lot of other places, and then kind of started Failed Architecture. So how did that? Mm-hmm. I guess I have two questions basically. How did Failed Architecture start, or kind of how did that begin? And then the sub question is, just for listeners who don't know what it is, can you kind of give the high level pitch of what Failed Architecture is?
Yeah. Okay. I'll first say something about the genesis then, because it started from inside a building in Amsterdam, and the story started with this building because we were a group of people who were organizing cultural programs at this place, and this place was called Trouw Amsterdam. It was a former printing press of I think 3 national newspapers, but the printing press moved out, I think around 2007 or a bit earlier, and then around that time. The place was starting to be used as a club, so a nightclub, a restaurant, and a cultural venue.
Okay.
And at some point, it was one of the most popular nightclubs in Europe. I think about 7 years ago.
Oh wow.
But also, it was also clear from the start that the building would have to be demolished soon to make way for like upscale residential development. So that's where the question started. So hey, apparently this building is a failure because it has to go. But who decides what? When can you call something a failure, and according to whom? And in some respects, it was enormously successful also. So, starting from that, Failed Architecture started as a series of events, talk shows, debates about, let's say, places that either have failed to stand the test of time or were problematic in one way or another. So we invited people from all over the world to talk about different places, and at the same time we started a blog. It was a very, very simple Tumblr page.
Nice.
And it was basically a collection of case studies that were in one way or another comparable to the building in Amsterdam. But very short, a few pictures and a short description. And quickly we noticed that it caught on. So a lot of people visited the blog. the title helps, of course, because
Yeah.
people like, whoa, what's this? What's this about? So we noticed like, hey, we've got something here, and started expanding our online presence, I think. So we also started inviting other people to contribute, and
Right.
doing a little bit more like, I don't know, critical or in-depth pieces, more essays. And then at some point, um, it evolved into a WordPress page, and
Yeah.
new design, and then another design, and scaling up, and
Hmm.
etc. And So that's a start, and then from there, we also started doing like research workshops in places mostly around Europe at the start, and then also outside of Europe, in which we would like together with an organization in the city that we would go to,
Hmm.
pick like a case, a problematic piece of architecture in that city,
Oh, interesting.
and just figure out what's going on there. And usually with a lot of participants, mostly students, young professionals, whoever wanted to join. So there was like another lag, um, and that started to develop.
Right.
I think around 6 years ago, and that's yeah. You wanted to know what field architecture is about, you know?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so how? I mean, for somebody who doesn't, it's I have like a bunch of questions now just based on
Mm-hmm.
everything that you just said. But before I kind of get into those, just for people that aren't familiar with the site, how do you talk about it now, or what is the kind of
Yeah,
that way that you describe it? Because it actually is very similar to the origins, but it has expanded in a lot of different ways.
yeah. I think you're right. I think there are many ways of explaining it, and maybe my fellow failed architects would explain it differently. But I think that's also something we say on our website. I'm not sure, but I would call it like a platform for critical urban discourse.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and and we try to look at architecture not just as a design object,
Right.
or a formal or stylistic thing, but much more as an expression of larger social, political developments. Yeah, so yeah, and I can say much more about it, but yeah, this is the core for me, I think, and also I think we cherish it as a place of critical spatial analysis, especially in the field of um, especially for a title that or a publication that has architecture in its title, because
Right.
architectural media are usually very like positivist or
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
solutionist
Yeah.
or celebratory of architecture, of new spatial developments, and we try to, rather than celebrating it, we try to complicate things a little
Yeah.
bit, or
Yeah. Totally.
bring in some nuances to the success stories. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's you set up exactly what kind of my next couple questions were going to be, and it's interesting to hear you describe the site that way, because as you were talking about your background and kind of what you were studying in school and how you got into architecture, I totally see that influence in the writing on the site, and that it isn't
Mhm.
just this kind of positive kind of celebration, kind of like let's talk about buildings and aesthetics. There is always that kind of deeper and more critical lens to it across everything that you publish. And so I guess I'm saying that to say that I see
Mhm.
the influence of kind of your background and the way you talked about how you got into all of this on the site. Um, but it then does it. I have a couple questions around. I don't know if you'd call it the editorial vision or kind of how you
Mhm.
think about publishing, but do you consider the essays on the site works of architecture criticism, or does that distinction of criticism versus essay versus journalism versus like profile. How do you kind of see that, and how do you think about that for the site?
Geez, then we'd have to talk about what exactly is architecture criticism, right? For
Yeah.
example.
Well, I'll tell you my next question, and maybe that, or the question that I was kind of getting
Yeah.
to, and maybe that will help, is when I was preparing for this interview, I stumbled upon something you had written, I think back in 2014, about Arch Daily and how big of a site that is, but it's often just kind of architect PR pieces, and there isn't a critical lens, and how failed architecture is not a direct response to that, but is kind of trying to provide an alternative to that. And in that piece that you wrote, you talked about how failed architecture's audience will never be as big as Arch Daily, and just kind of talking about clickbait and those types of things. And that's kind of, I was curious how you kind of think about that, and about the discourse in general, and where you fit into that.
Yeah. Oh wow. I don't.
Sorry,
I
that
think
was like a huge question all of a sudden.
No. It's all right. It's not that big. Yeah, I think that was a very quick post that I did about
Yeah, and it was only
Arch Daily and architecture criticism.
Yeah.
Very short post. And it was I mean, let's say the dominant architectural media, at least on the internet, are something that we like to provide an alternative for, because most of them are, and if we put it bluntly, are just republishing the press releases of architects.
Right.
And we like to do a little more and try to analyze what it is that we're seeing in the world around us, and how did it come into being, and who paid for it, and who is going to benefit from it. Questions like these. So yeah, I think it's about adding another layer to architecture or the built environment.
Mm-hmm. Are you writing for architects, for people in the profession, or who do you see as the audience for the site, or even the audience kind of for these types of pieces?
Yeah, I should have a clear answer to this, right? Because this is what I do, or what we do.
Yeah.
But I think it's often like a lot of the things that we write about are just the outcome of personal fascinations.
Right. Yeah.
And then sometimes you just really write for yourself. But no, there are a couple of things. I think so. On the one hand, we want to complicate what it is when we talk about architecture. So that's, on the one hand, it's for architects maybe, because yeah, I mean, I would, and I'm not saying that they don't, but I would encourage architects and architecture students to look at more things than Arch Daily and the zine and this magazine, like I think it's called Detail, right?
Yeah.
So that's, in that sense, it's aimed at the profession, and also sometimes it's a direct criticism of the profession or of the outcome of it. But it's also, I mean, we try to be accessible in our writing. So it's also about, this relates to what I said before, that the architectural discourse can be very exclusive or exclusionary. And so on the one hand, it's superficial and simplifying the built environment into design objects. And on the other hand, there's architectural discourse that I sometimes don't even understand. What's going on. So we also try to make more, let's say, more analytical work. We try to make it accessible also to a larger audience, so that more people can have the feeling like, hey, I can also have something to say about architecture.
Yeah, it was interesting to me when I read that piece that you had written about how similar your goals were to kind of my goals in
Mm.
graphic design writing and graphic design criticism, because it's the exact same problem. There's essentially two camps. There's the very popular graphic design websites that honestly feature the same designers over and over. There isn't often a critical lens. They're almost kind of like portfolio presentations, like, look at this cool stuff that's happening. It's very image heavy without any kind of context or analysis.
Yeah.
And that's a blanket statement. I don't mean to say that everybody does that, but that's the popular thing. That's what my design students, when they're reading design websites, those are the types of sites that they're looking at. But then there's the academic graphic design side, which is very theoretical and very inaccessible, that I often don't understand. And my interest is somehow finding a middle to that. Taking that stuff that's happening in the academic side and making it available to more people without oversimplifying it and glorifying the work in a way, but then kind of providing that critical lens. So I don't know if that was actually a question, other than to say that
it's a way of saying, like, I feel you, man.
Yeah.
I mean, not to dismiss like academic discourse or theoretical discourse, because we're super happy with all the academics writing for us, but we do encourage them to write in a more, let's say, popular way, and we really do our best to cut out all the jargon and all the academic references. I mean, I think that you should be able to translate these into a more or less everyday language.
Right. Exactly.
So that's something that we work hard on, and also, I mean, clickbait is a dirty word, of course, but I mean, we also we definitely try to come up with catchy titles and add good images to the articles, of course, to make sure, I mean, because we're proud of our content, so we want a lot of people to read it. So, why not use let's say, the tools that are at hand to spread your message?
That's actually really interesting, because I was thinking about this when I was thinking about what I wanted to talk to you about, and you mentioned this earlier, that even the name Failed Architecture has a certain kind of clickbait quality to it. And it's almost like I'm trying to frame this in a positive, but it's almost like a little trick. It has this kind of really kind of bold title or bold name, and then the titles of your stories kind of have this kind of hook, and then you get to the site and it's not always what you expect. It's a little bit slower. It's a little bit more thoughtful. It goes a little bit deeper than you think it would go. I think one of the early pieces I remember seeing on the site was, and I'm sorry, I forget who wrote it, but it was about the best showrooms, those kind of like avant-garde. Of
course, the store, the chain, the American department store.
Exactly.
It's Margaret McCormick who wrote it.
That's right. That's right. Because there was a best store in the town that I grew up in, but it was not one of those fancy ones. It was just like a normal kind of department store. I think it was like right after that kind of ended, and I had no idea that there was that background. And so I thought I was coming to the site just to look at some images, and I got this really amazing, well-written kind of history of not just these buildings and not just the architects, but also about retail and the kind of evolution of department stores. Is that something that you're kind of consciously thinking about as an editor or as a publisher, that you are not just writing about buildings, you're not just writing about the built world, but you are connecting it to these larger stories, these larger histories?
Absolutely. Yeah, totally. And it relates to like also trying to reach out to audiences that are not necessarily would not pick up an architectural magazine.
Right.
So I mean, this is a great example, and we were lucky that Margaret pitched it with us. I mean, she's done more pieces for us, and she's a great writer. So I would encourage people to look at her work on our site. No, that's something that we really try to look at. That also the stories about architecture also talk about other, let's say, cultural fields. You know, we really like pieces about music, and through music also talking about architecture, because then, I mean, it's much easier to reach a different audience, because then it's about a certain type of music or an artist that people can relate to and can like draw them into architecture. And I mean, we've done pieces about like video games and the development of it, or arts in the broadest sense. Yeah.
When I started getting into graphic design criticism, I saw a lot of people kind of saying things like we should look at film criticism or art criticism as a comparison of look at how these fields have this great kind of critical discourse around them. And as I was starting to think about this more deeply, I found architecture criticism to be the closest comparison over, say, an art criticism or movie critic, because architecture is so much like graphic design in that there's often, it's not just kind of free expression. There's often larger kind of political and economic stories that are around it. And that's very similar to graphic design. And graphic design doesn't really have a place for people to talk about design in that way. And as a designer looking at architecture, I was always kind of like, oh, wow, look, the architecture critics, they get it. Like, this is what we should have. And then I've been doing this podcast for over 2 years now, and I'm realizing that it's not as robust as I thought it was. That there are people doing it. You of course are one of them. But can you kind of talk about that a little bit? About this is it's a big question, but just kind of your thoughts on architecture criticism or architecture discourse, or even just kind of the state of the discourse and how you see yourself fitting in there, or what you kind of want to see more of, or, kind of what's missing, or where is it kind of not working?
Yeah. Well, I think it's, on the one hand, it's a dying profession.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people would agree. Like, if you look at the amount of architecture critics that were employed by newspapers 20 years ago and compared to today, then you see a steep decline. And the same goes for the more critical magazines, or more theoretical magazines. So that's pretty sad. I mean, and the simplification of architecture, I think it fits into the larger, let's say, superficialization or polarization of society, maybe even. And then at the same time, there are really fascinating things happening also with people trying to do criticism in different ways. I see there's a real review lying in there right behind you on the table.
Yeah.
And
I had Jack on the podcast about a year ago. Yeah. It was one of my favorite interviews, actually.
I did listen to it, actually. Yeah. It was really good. Yeah. And I mean, that's a new way of doing architecture criticism, it's not even necessarily about architecture, the magazine. It's about much more.
Right.
But it's a way of getting people to think about the way we live and the spaces we inhabit in a different way. So, and there's more things happening, but in general, I mean, it is No, I'm not super optimistic, but I think that a lot of people aren't, and that's also maybe why something like failed architecture does work.
Yeah.
Because more people are seeing, the decline of architectural media or architecture criticism.
This is something that just occurred to me now, so I haven't fully thought out this thought that I'm about to kind of pitch to you and see what you think. But something I think about a lot in regards to graphic design is that the field has just expanded so much in the last 10 or 15 years where, graphic design for a long time was books, book covers, posters. That's, that sort of thing, magazines. And now it's apps and exhibitions and websites and, these digital experiences that just because the field has grown, one of the reasons it's hard to have a kind of strong discourse is because everybody's kind of doing their own thing. And that to talk about graphic design criticism as a kind of overarching thing to kind of cover all of those almost doesn't even make sense anymore. And that's why there are all these kind of little, kind of smaller websites, other podcasts, that sort of thing that are kind of serving those kind of unique areas. And I'm wondering if architecture might be similar in that there might not be these kind of big kind of central places where this discourse is happening, but there are people like yourself, there are people like The Real Review, that there are all these smaller ones. Does that kind of make up for it in some way? Does that kind of dispersion make it harder to have a conversation? I don't know. I just kind of thought about how there might not be big architecture publications anymore, but there are a lot of kind of small independent ones. How do those start to talk to each other?
Well, that's a good point, because it's having all these, like, let's say, niche publications. It's also a little bit about it's it's a case of preaching to the choir, right? It's talking to your own kinds of people, and that's something that we also notice, and that we would also like to break out of a little bit. We did make it to the alt-right media here in the Netherlands a few months ago, because we published something about the title was Amsterdam's Architecture of Colonial Exploitation. So basically it looks at this famous canal district here in Amsterdam as a result of slave trade and other types of exploitation. Which still, is something that people of our choir, so to say, would only agree on. Yeah, it's important that these things are being mentioned, but then we were also being picked up finally by another kind of medium, and it was well, this is not necessarily something that I would like to get more of, but but it does illustrate, I think, that everybody's is talking in their own bubble, and sometimes you enter another bubble, but then it's so polarized that people don't listen to each other. They're just fighting each other, and there's no conversation. Now within, of course, that's not the case with these little niches within a certain discipline. Right. That's, I'm sure they all are like each other, but they don't necessarily talk a lot. And one thing that came to mind when you asked the question is that I do think it's a shame that architecture is not really part of the public discourse anymore, the larger public discourse. So the newspapers are not really talking about architecture in interesting ways anymore. And I don't know about the States, but in a lot of European countries, there used to be television shows, like even primetime television would be about architecture, and that you would even have like eloquent architecture critics talking about the spaces around us in really interesting ways. But I mean, there's none of that
Right.
anymore. And you could say, of course, that the internet is a substitute for it or replaced this. But then again, you are mostly talking to your own kind of people. So no, I'm not very optimistic. No, I don't really know how to
Yeah.
break out of it. I don't know. Do you have any ideas?
No, I mean, I was going to ask you if you had thoughts on how to do it. I don't know the best way to do it other than kind of connecting. Can you connect these things to people's real lives?
Yeah.
It's like what we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, where it's the building or the piece of design almost becomes a object that can talk about something bigger. And it doesn't end with the object or the building or the poster or the website or whatever, but it's like, here's this designed thing, and this has influence on our lives outside of the thing itself.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that. That seems to be or I think that's a way to get people interested, but I don't know how to get that out there either. It's a distribution problem also.
Yeah, you're right. Absolutely. And it's, I mean, we do try it, of course, and we do try to also give a voice to people that we would not. I mean, people would not expect us to agree with. We also try to have interest. Conversations with, I don't know, real estate developers.
Right.
But then, and be genuinely interested in trying to understand what they're doing instead of just having a hard talk or a fight over something. So, that's about engaging, I think, with the things that you are not necessarily a fan of, but maybe starting some sort of a dialogue. And like you said, try to relate to other fields as well. Like we did a podcast on video games and the architecture of video games. So for which my colleague Charlie talked to people from the video game industry, and so trying to reach out and also to musicians, for example. Try to reach out and reach a different audience based on these cultural, I don't know, signifiers or actors.
I mean, I don't want to make this about, I don't want to make this conversation about this podcast, but like that's kind of one of my goals, is that I'm a graphic designer that started as a graphic design podcast, but I'm also talking to architects, to critics and theorists, to urbanists, to novelists now, to kind of start to see if there can be some sort of dialogue just even between the guests, and does that then bring in different listeners? And I think it's worked to varying degrees of success, but I think the way you're talking about is kind of exactly, again, the way that I kind of even just think about this podcast.
Yeah. No, and I really applaud you for doing it, and for doing like 170 episodes in 2 years. Yeah,
100. Yeah, you're 108.
That's wow.
I did not say that for you to compliment me, but thank you. I appreciate that.
No, but I mean, because we have done like 6 in 5 months, so which is not bad, I think. So, but what you've done is really incredible. I don't know. You probably sleep like 2 hours a night.
Yeah, I should probably get more sleep, honestly.
Yeah.
I have a couple questions just to kind of wrap it up. I'm curious, what are the subjects or the topics that you're really interested in right now, either that you kind of want to write about, things you're researching, where kind of what's next for you? What are the the ideas that are getting you excited?
Let's see. Let's think. I'm in general. I think maybe first because that's also a move that I've seen within field architecture, that we started off also with a lot of historical pieces as well. And we're slowly becoming more, publishing more and more things that are about current developments or developments in the near future. So that's something I like being on top of things that are currently happening, and shed a critical light on them. So that's something that and that I also think I'm trying to do in my own writing, and in a podcast, for example, because I always start thinking of topics now, and then the second thing is what's the best medium to work it out in, like either in audio or in a written piece, or maybe visuals for the website. Well, a year ago I started doing research on data centers.
Nice.
And the proliferation of them, and it was also the topic of the first podcast episode that we published. But now I think I want to do more with them, because I was at a conference recently also about data centers, and it's really interesting that big firms like OMA are also doing research on the topic, and coming up with designs for data centers, and seeing data centers as these emblems of or I don't know, these totems of our time, and then of course the challenge is, how do you design these things, and who do you design them for? Is it for machines? Is it for humans?
Right.
So that's interesting, and I am I have a couple of more like half ideas that I want to work on, because I'm reading and talking to a lot of people about the relationship between spatial design and urban life and mental health. So see how these influence each other, not only in design, so the type of spaces that are good for your brain, but also in terms of how the more socio-economic makeup of the city affects people's mental well-being. I think it's going to be a podcast, but I'm not sure yet. There's many more aspects. I also want to I'm interested in looking at architecture through the eyes of people that are not usually the people designing spaces.
Interesting.
That's also what the Alexandra Lang, who's also been on your podcast, which was great for me to listen to as a research for preparing my interview with her, because we talked about her book, The Design of Childhood.
So I loved that book.
It's really good.
Yeah.
I love her writing and her way of talking about design and architecture. So that's of course, that's experiencing design through the eyes or experience of children. But you could, of course, think of all kinds of other minorities, how they experience design. I would like to do a podcast with people with visual disabilities, and talk to them about how they experience certain spaces, maybe famous architectural masterpieces. How are they are they good spaces for blind people, for example? But usually my fascinations really shift every few months, and then there's another thing I dive into.
I'm the same way.
Yeah.
speaking of Alexandra Lang, that kind of actually leads into my last question. I was curious, who are the other writers that you really love reading, or the books that have kind of influenced you, or that you find yourself turning to again and again? What's the stuff that you're reading and that you're really liking right now?
Yeah. Well, maybe a few more words about Alexandra Lang then.
Go for it.
Because I really like her writing. I mean, she's super knowledgeable and always does a lot of research, but she manages to to bring it across in such an accessible way in her book, but also her work for Curbed, where she's the architecture and design critic. And the New Yorker, I think, is really good. I love the long form pieces that she's done for the New Yorker, because it's almost like you're entering a movie, or a documentary. So she's really writing in scenes, which is, of course, a very much of a New Yorker thing to do. So,
right.
But such vivid stories, and really drawing people in through personal narratives, etc. And then, after, when you're in there, you also get to know all the nitpicky details about some urban development, or about part of architectural history. So it's really great in many ways, and that's also why I like reading the New Yorker, because there are a lot of cues in there of how you can make writing more accessible.
Yeah.
I'm also a big fan of Oliver Wainwright's writing for The Guardian, because he also he's one of the people, I think, who I look at. That's a way of architecture criticism that I like to do as well.
Yeah.
He doesn't look at a building as just look at the result, but also how did it get made. Where did the money come from? Why this building, or why not something else? So he really looks at the financial and the social sides to it. And that's I think everybody should read his work too. And Richard Sennett always.
Oh yeah, of course.
He's that's someone who I always like to get back to and read. I think one of the first things that I read from him was about the New York grid in his book Conscience of the Eye, and it just really opened up. Well, I think he also really inspired me in thinking about architecture, because he's trying to bring all these social and political sciences to the built environment and to architecture. And his latest book is also just incredible in doing so, the Building and Dwelling.
Yeah, I haven't read that one yet. It's been on my list since it came out. Yeah, you should read it. It's really great, because he talks about building on the one hand, which is architecture, urbanism. And then dwelling on the other hand, which is, let's say, the lived experience of space, of a place, which is in many cases something completely different. And they're also completely out of sync with each other so often. So, and the way he writes about it is just, it's incredible. I got to get it. You're not the first person to mention that new book in these conversations. It's been on my list. I just got to buy it. I'll just do it right after we hang up.
Yeah.
That's I think that's actually a great way to kind of wrap this up. Mark, I'm a big fan of failed architecture and your work.
Thanks.
And think that you're just kind of doing it right. And I really love what you're doing, and I really love the site, and I'm glad we finally got to have this conversation. So thanks for being on the podcast.
Wow, so happy to hear that. And thanks for having me. Thanks for being on and being part of your enormous streak of episodes with a lot of great people. So I'm also impressed that you you're getting all these people on the show. So good job, and keep it up.
Thanks.
I'll keep on listening.
This episode was recorded on November 2nd, 2018. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.